Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So I started my subclass ranking videos back in June, and I knew, like, with over 100 subclasses to rank, this wasn't going to be a quick series. But, the first couple videos I did, I kind of just quickly talked about the features, and then I found that as the series went on, I started analyzing the features more deeply. So each video started taking longer to make as we moved towards the end. I mean, the first video I did was the Artificer. That was less than 20 minutes. And of course, that's only 4 subclasses. But even the Barbarian that followed that, it was like 22 minutes. But by the end, each video was like in the range of an hour each. And Wizards needed to be split into 2 parts because it was significantly larger than an hour. And first thing, I want to thank everyone who watched. These videos got a lot of response, and they averaged about 500 comments each per video, so people were really engaged with them. I read as many of the comments as I could. Monks, of course, was an outlier, because as soon as I do a video criticizing Monk, and this wasn't a surprise, it ends up on Reddit, and then I get a lot of visitors to, kind of come and just tell me that I'm wrong. So that one ended up with over 1,000 comments. There were a couple questions that came up multiple times. Would I summarize the list at the end? Would I discuss how the base class affected the overall rank? Are there any rankings I would change after feedback? And how did the classes do overall once we got to the end? I decided to answer these questions in today's video. If you like the content on this channel and you'd be interested in supporting it, you can do so through Patreon. Patrons of this channel receive rewards like being able to see these videos early and ad-free. And my top level patrons can join me and play some D&D every month. Check the link in the video description if you're interested. Otherwise, I'd like to thank these top-level patrons: Loxodon13, Martz, Math Guy Dave, Matt, Mouse the Tank, Mikhail Precursor, Nathaniel McCauley, Nick Lutz, Nick Simmons, and Odessian. Thank you all so much for your support. Let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about, though, is how I did the rankings in the first place, or how did I approach them. The first thing I did was, I made these tokens, because, there were a lot of tokens, so that actually took a significant amount of time. But once I did that, then I had to kind of figure out how I would do the ranks. Because, the simple way is, the lousy stuff is F and the great stuff is S. But I want to have a differentiation for it, because some things that are powerful aren't always good. Sometimes things are powerful and they make the game objectively worse. So I wanted to have a specific category for that. So I decided S would be game-breaking mechanics, or mechanics that I think are problematic for the game. And really what I would consider the best and most powerful classes ended up A's. A subclasses would be easy to optimize and very powerful. B would be fairly easy to optimize and fairly powerful. And then C, I guess to some degree, C is kind of the sweet spot. Optimized characters using these subclasses would be well balanced against other subclasses, and there's some good challenge in terms of optimization. It's not just all given to you on the page. A D rank would be really challenging, but salvageable. But once we got to E, now we're probably talking about subclasses that are just plain underpowered. And then F would be so weak that they end up being a problem as well. Because if you have a character that just doesn't function, or you play a session and you're just completely overshadowed, that's a problem too. So when I look at the end ranks here, honestly, I think if you wanted to make the game better, it really should look more like this. I think that would be a better game than what we have. Though, after completing the series, I think if I went back, I would change the rankings a bit. The thing I would definitely change is the S rank. I don't think I should have put problematic classes at the top of the list. What I probably should have done, or problematic subclasses at the top of the list, what I should have done is I should have had a separate category, probably at the bottom, and then, just called it something like problematic mechanics, and then put those down there so that, the subclasses that ended up in the A rank would have been at the top of the list. And yeah, hindsight 2020, but if I could go back, having the S rank be that category probably was a mistake. Maybe B and D should have encompassed a bit more, and I think one thing I regret is that there was a bit of a perception that A subclasses were, better than B subclasses. And I guess it's that I don't always think that powerful is better. I mean, I am an optimizer, obviously, so class and subclass power absolutely plays a huge part in my character builds. But I guess I just find that a class or subclass that has one really amazing trick they just do over and over again because it's just so good compared to everything else they can do, that can be really powerful. But I'm just not sure it's as fun to play, at least over an extended period. But I guess that wasn't the point of this ranking chart because I said this was a power rank. But anyway, the next thing I did was I ranked all the subclasses before any deep analysis based on where I thought they would end up, just based on my preconceptions. I revised the list as I went, and overall it wasn't hugely different than what I ended up with. But, a lot of subclasses did end up moving one way or another after I took a deep look at them. None of them moved a huge amount. And again, hindsight, making this video, I'm like, wouldn't it be great for me to share the image of what my original guesses were? And I didn't take a picture, and I don't have that anymore, so I can't share with you where everything was. But I can tell you some of the subclasses that moved quite a bit. The one that moved the most is the Arcane Archer. That one was a bit of a surprise to me because Arcane Archers are notoriously bad, and I've always agreed with that opinion. But I took a good look at Arcane Shot when I did this list, and the more I noticed that, you do not get enough Arcane Shots, but they are quite good. And you do still get 2 of them. I mean, if you think Arcane Archer sucks, I get if you're saying it sucks because you only get 2 arrows, because that does really limit things. But as far as those actual arrows, take a look at something like Grasping Arrow. Extra damage, automatic slowing, continual damage, eats up enemy actions, and it doesn't even rely on intelligence. Not that Arcane Archer ended up high on the list, it ended up being 83rd out of 114 subclasses, but I was originally having it somewhere around 15 spots lower, around the 100 mark. So that one moved up a fair bit. Though actually, when I did the fighter video, a lot of people disagreed. So my deep dive there actually probably took me away from the popular opinion. So that does make me think that that's a subclass I probably need to play around with at some point. Maybe there's a build video in the future. I'll be thinking about that. After I did that, I looked at the base classes. At first on a very superficial level. I just looked at, spellcasting, martial abilities, anything else really substantial. Like, do they have full casting? Do they have extra attack? If they're martial class, how well do their features combine with feats? What are their standout features, and how do they compare with similar features of other classes? Then I looked a bit deeper. How good are the spell lists? How versatile are the spell lists? What features complement each other? Do they have half casting? If they do the spells complement what the base class can already do? Because in my opinion, a half caster can't just rely on spells. They're just not good enough at casting spells to compare with a primary spellcaster. Now, I was asked a few times where I would put the classes on the tier list if they had no subclasses at all. I think if you look at the lowest ranked subclass for each class, that's going to be pretty close because some of the subclasses are really bad and they add almost nothing. So in those cases, I probably didn't rank them much higher than I would have the base class. I can tell you right away, Artificers and Monks would both rank F. Rogues, Barbarians, and Fighters, they might make an E. Rangers, Warlocks, Clerics, Sorcerers, and Druids, probably up to D. And the rest likely in the C range. Nothing would have been higher than that. Anyways, after the superficial analysis of the classes, then I did a deep dive on the classes and the subclasses, and I did those as the series went on. Generally, if a subclass added nothing or next to nothing, it probably didn't rate much higher than the base class. I basically had a feature ranking system in my head, and if you watch the videos, you probably picked that up because I tended to use the same words over and over when describing features. Was a feature bad or okay or decent? Was it good? Was it great or fantastic? If a low-level feature was good or great, that subclass was getting ranked a lot higher. The higher level stuff had far less impact on the final ranks. If I thought a class had a really good chance of being multiclassed out of before then, even less. So let's do our summary of where everything ended up. First, let's just do some silly awards. The class with the most subclasses sandwiched together award goes to the Cleric, with Death, Knowledge, Grave, and Nature domains all ending up side by side. The no subclasses on the same tier award goes to the Artificer. No two subclasses ended up on the same tier. The biggest range on the same tier goes to the Fighter, with Battlemaster ranked 50th overall and Arcane Archer all the way down at 83rd, but they were the bookends of the C tier. The most subclasses in a single tier award goes to the Cleric, with 9 subclasses in the C tier. That's more subclasses than most classes have. The biggest range from top to bottom goes to the Warlock, with 84 ranks between Hexblade and Undying. The reason for this huge difference was because with Warlocks I was really looking at multiclassing. If you were to do these Warlocks straight classed, I think there would be a lot less separation. The smallest range from top to bottom award, and I thought Paladin would get this one for sure, because those were kind of my thoughts as I was doing that video. But actually, it's the Monk, with only 29 ranks separating the salvageable Mercy and the abysmal Sun Soul. Paladin was close though, 30 between Watchers and Crown. So let's look at how each class did overall. I've got the ranks from 1 to 114. I'm not going to list them out, but I will post them in the video description, so if you are curious about it, it's there for you. But what I am going to do is go over how every class did compared to the rest. So we have 13 classes. The one that got the lowest rank, of course, is the Monk. If you were to take all the subclass ranks for the Monk and average them out, it averaged 107 out of 114 subclasses. This shouldn't have been a surprise to anybody. It certainly wasn't a surprise to me. Then, at number 12, ended up being the Rogue. That was actually a little bit of a surprise to me. I thought it might be the Barbarian. It wasn't. It was the Rogue. Average rank 91. And again, 91 out of 114, so Rogue did not do well. Then at number 11, that's where we ended up with the Barbarian, with an average rank of 88. So, it wasn't too far off the Rogue. Number 10, the Artificer. Lots of people disagreed with me on this, but, when I look at the Artificer-based class, it is not a caster, right? Like, it's a half caster, but it is not a real caster. It can't really rely on that fully, or if it does, it's just going to be completely overshadowed by like half the classes in the game. Right? It's not like there's only a couple full casters. There's lots of full casters. So by giving Artificer half casting, it ends up being in the bottom half for casting spells. And there's no martial capability built into the class at all. So you end up being a crappy caster who can hand out some minor magic items. And those are limited as well. And frankly, in a campaign where magic weapons are a thing, the impact of that is somewhat minor. Yep, you can get Pipes of Haunting. They're good, but they're also narrow in purpose. And they don't replace not being a full caster. Then we get to number 9, and that is where the Fighter ended up. That one actually surprised me as well. I kind of thought the Ranger might end up below the Fighter, but it didn't. Apparently, when I do the deep analysis, Fighter is below the Ranger. Still, we're not in terrible territory anymore. We're talking 9th out of 13 classes. Average rank of 72, so it did a fair bit better than the Artificer. Then we get to number 8, and here is where the Ranger ended up. So we're getting pretty darn close to the middle of the road, and that's where I think the Ranger is. As I mentioned in that video, there are some people who think the Ranger is the worst class in the game. I don't think that at all. Then there are other people who think the Ranger is one of the best classes in the game, and which is weird because there's such a huge disparity between these opinions. And obviously I don't agree with that either. I think Rangers are fine, and their ranking shows that. Average rank 67 out of 114, just barely below average. Then we get to number 7, so this is just exactly the middle of the road, and that is where the Warlock ended up. Average rank of 54 out of 114, 7th out of 13, so right in the middle. And I talked a lot in the Warlock video about the difficulty of analyzing that class because it's such a 1-level dip or 2-level dip for so many builds, and then you have these higher level features that a lot of Warlocks aren't going to see. But you know what? I've seen straight class warlocks as well, so you kind of had to juggle those when coming up with the rankings. And some warlock subclasses are really good, and then you got the Undying. So as I mentioned earlier, there was a huge gap between the best warlock and the worst warlock on the actual chart. That brings us to number 6, so now we're top half, and that is where the Cleric ended up. This one I actually thought was going to end up higher than it was, but I think what brought it down was, as part of this series, I really did dive into analysis, and when I talked about spellcasting for spellcasters, I started to really analyze what they could do with spells. And the Cleric just can do less with spells than other full spellcasters. Not that the Cleric doesn't have great spells. I mean, I've talked about Bless, I've talked about Spirit Guardians, I've talked about Mass Heal. There are great spells on the Cleric spell list. It's just when it comes to the different kind of challenges that spells can take care of, the spell list for Clerics ends up being more limiting than other full spellcasters. That brings us to number 5, and that is where the Sorcerer ended up. And the reason why it ended up on the lower end of the kind of the full spellcasters is most sorcerers, there's now a couple of exceptions, but most sorcerers really struggle with a spells known mechanic. And I just talked about versatility with the Cleric, and that essentially ends up being a problem with the Sorcerer as well, because not that their spell list isn't versatile, but because they can't select enough spells to cover as many things as other spellcasters can. Now we're kind of getting into the top tier stuff. So at number 4 ended up being the Druid. Druid did very well, actually higher than I expected it. And I knew summoning is kind of the thing for Druids, but then I looked at battlefield control and I'm like, the Druid is comparable to the Wizard in battlefield control, arguably in some ways even better. And battlefield control, by the way, is really powerful spellcasting. And yeah, the Druid just ended up doing pretty well. None of the Druids did badly, but average rank 40. Though I'll note that the Druid, the Sorcerer, and the Cleric, although obviously they end up 4, 5, 6, so there is an order, the numbers between them, Druid averaging 40, Cleric averaging 48, not a big difference between those. Now we're going to get into our top 3. So number 3 ended up being the Bard. And I'm telling you right now, I would have guessed Bard would have been number 2. But it didn't. It ended up number 3, average rank 37. The one that ended up number 2 was the Paladin. And this is the biggest shock for me on the list. 2 is much higher than I thought. But I guess it all comes down to their level 6 feature is so good. And then it's combined on other good stuff. I mean, if the Paladins didn't get that huge saving throw boost to themselves and everyone around them, even then, I think the Paladin would still be an okay class. So you throw that on top of that, and it just kind of brings it up so that it is right in the midst of those full spellcasters and ahead of a lot of them. And number 1, again, just like the Monk, shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. It was the Wizard with an average rank of 17, because Wizards are really good. And if I was to talk about classes without subclasses, the Wizard would be at the top of the list. But the thing about the Wizard is, you would think that might be combined with subclasses that don't do a lot. But Wizard subclasses, I don't think there's a single Wizard subclass that's terrible. I just don't. Every single subclass for Wizard delivers. And some deliver just a ton of stuff. I mean, some Wizard subclasses are a lot better than others. But even the weaker ones aren't terrible. And then you throw that on top of the great Wizard base class, it just was a foregone conclusion. This was no surprise to me at all. Wizard, no surprise. Monk, no surprise. Few surprises in between. Paladin, probably the biggest one, ended up a lot higher than I thought. Other than that, a spot or two here or there. And I should say that, we could rank this in a number of different ways. I didn't remove anomalies from this. So when you have something like Moon Druid, it bumped Druid up a bit. If I had taken the anomalies out, this ranking chart would look a little bit different, though honestly probably still pretty close to this. Now, coming up on like 2 years ago, I did a class tier list, and I didn't do a deep analysis for that. I just was sharing the knowledge I had. And there are definitely changes here. The Wizard I knew was number 1 back then, and apparently my opinion hasn't changed on that. But Paladin on that video I said was the 4th best class. And according to my deep analysis here, I'm getting 2nd best class. So that is, again, a little bit of a surprise to me. Sorcerer actually bumped up from a 7th rank to 5th rank, but when it comes to that tier list, Tasha's hadn't come out yet. And I do think Tasha's made a big difference with the Sorcerer because both Aberrant Mind and Clockwork Soul did really well on the rankings, so that bumped up that average. Cleric went down quite a bit. I had put Cleric as the 3rd most powerful in this ranking chart. It ended up being the 6th most powerful, which is still top half. But again, it came down to when you think about, oh, well, this is a full spellcaster, and this is a full spellcaster, except they also get more hit points and armor, then, the second one looks better. But when you really look at the spells that they can cast and kind of the spell lists that they're going to have prepared to deal with different kinds of challenges, I just don't think the Cleric quite measures up to those other spellcasters, and that kind of analysis came into this ranking, and it didn't so much in the other one. Ranger bumped up a couple spots. I had ranked it 10th, and now it's ranked 8th. Again, I think Tash has affected this a lot because Ranger's got a lot of stuff in Tasha's. Rogue slipped. It had been ranked 9th, and now I ranked it 12th. Again, this one was a bit of a surprise too. I expected the Rogue to do better than it did. I think for one thing, a lot of other classes did well in Tasha's, and the Rogue didn't do as well. And some of the other classes got really amazing subclasses in Tasha's. Like, look at the Cleric, of course, ended up with 2 subclasses that ended up broken S tier on here. But even like with the Sorcerer, with Aberrant Mind and Clockwork, Druids had great subclasses. I mean, I could go on. Tasha's had a lot of really good subclasses, and Rogue had a couple okay ones, and not as much for optional class features, and I think that's part of the reason it fell down. And then Monk, again, no surprise. And I've said over and over again that Mercy Monk can work, and I am glad it exists because it can work, and it's the first time the Monk has had a subclass where I think it's playable without the severe limitations that the Monk has. Or, I mean, it does have those limitations, but it has some ways to circumvent some of them. But it's not enough to bring the Monk as a whole out of the 13th spot, and they would need to have some really amazing subclasses come out in the future for that to ever change, or some amazing optional class features that kind of bring the Monk up to where other classes are. So the last thing I'm going to address is, would I change the ranks of any of the subclasses based on the feedback I had? And the answer is ultimately probably not. I mean, when I read the comments, I am looking for things where people might inform me of things that I'm not aware of. But, I mean, most of the people who disagreed were simply saying, that that's not where I would put it. And I wasn't basing these rankings on where I think the popular opinion is. I was basing the rankings on where I felt they should be. But if you ask me if there's any of them that I feel a little uneasy about or I'm not sure about, I would say number 1 would probably be the Artificer Armorer. I ranked that E. And I did get a lot of comments from people saying they thought it was a lot better than I ranked it. Now, I haven't seen a lot of builds for armor that I thought were going to be particularly effective. I mean, it's usually taking advantage of the one trick, right? The hit somebody and then they're marked trick. And that's okay, but on its own, I really think something like that needs to be complemented by something else, and I don't see the armor really bringing a lot to the table that way. But I will keep my eyes open. It wouldn't surprise me at all if at some point I have a higher opinion of it. So that's my summary, and this series is now done. So once again, I want to thank everybody who watched these videos, and now we're going to be going back into some other topics. So I hope you will join me. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I will talk to you soon.